Hello. Welcome to everybody. Thanks for coming. We've been having a lot of fun with these webinars at ISI. This one is going to be an especially fun one for me because I'm online with my father. Always a great experience. I'm going to read something quickly before I start this off. Just a quick ad from my organization. So, are you tired of progressive orthodoxy on campus? Eager to go beyond the narrow range of debate in the classroom? Learn timeless principles of liberty so you can pursue truth and freedom. ISI introduces students to the American tradition of liberty and a vibrant community of students and scholars. Our members get an education and a community they don't find at their universities. And in the process, they become articulate voices of conservative principles. To get the college education you deserve, become a member today at join.isi.org. So that's join.isi.org. Whether you're a student, faculty, alumni, that's the first place to start in order to get into our system, get our emails, start taking in our content, and get more involved if you're a student, because we mostly do programming for students. Okay, so that being said, welcome everybody. I guess this is the time that I officially introduce my father, who is a longtime filmmaker and documentarian. His funniest film is a documentary called Rediscovering Alexander Hamilton. If you want to see a historical documentary that's actually laugh out loud funny, that's the one to watch. I would say the one that I find most sort of enduring, since I work on college campuses, is Campus Culture Wars, which was made in like 92 or something, about political correctness on campus, and is just as relevant today, amazingly. And then I would say the one where I play the biggest role is the documentary on Admiral Rickover, the father of nuclear power. So if you want to see me in my as a star, watch that one. I would really recommend everything that he has made, but most recently, he's made a documentary on Clarence Thomas that is airing on May, wait a minute.
May 18th.
18th. I was about to say 19th. That's good. Okay, May 18th at 9 p.m. on PBS. So we want you all to go ahead and watch it. But in the meantime, you get the sneak peek preview with me talking to him. I worked as a production assistant on this film. He worked in the slightly less impressive role as producer and director. So feel free to ask any questions to him or me. If you do have questions, I would encourage you to ask them in this Q&A tab on the side of your screen. Feel free to use the chat to talk with one another, talk with me, etc. But I'll only take questions from the Q&A tab when I'm asking questions at the end. What do you think? Have you had an introduction like that before? I didn't read your bio at all. I'm going to have to go look you up on the website.
No, that was a very personal introduction. You really got a sense the person introduced me knew me well and wasn't just faking it. That's true, Thomas.
I'm putting the introduction, putting the Justice Clarence Thomas movie website right at the top of your screen, and you can all click on that to get a full bio and more details about the movie, when you can see it, where you can see it, watch a longer form trailer, etc. But in the meantime, I guess you and I, before I start asking you questions, we should watch a brief 30-second trailer of the film so people have a sense of what we're getting into here. Sorry about that. So video and drop the link.
When I was 6, I wandered the streets by myself. We were hungry and didn't know when you'd eat. We're supposed to be revolutionaries. We were for anybody who's kind of in your face. And I asked God that if you take anger out of my heart, I'll never hate again.
That I will nominate Judge Clarence Thomas to serve as Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court.
We know exactly what's going on here. This is the wrong black guy. He has to be destroyed.
Okay. Well, that's a great trailer. If you guys want to watch a longer form trailer, you can. It's on YouTube under the Manifold Productions YouTube channel. Okay, so first question for you. I got a new quarantine haircut, so two-parter. One, what do you think of it? And two, why haven't you said anything about it? Do you not like it?
No, I think it looks great, Thomas. You're lucky to have gotten a quarantine haircut. They're very rare and difficult to find. So
yours is getting pretty long there.
I need a quarantine haircut, no doubt.
Okay, well, so we just watched this trailer. Obviously couldn't capture very much in 30 seconds. Why don't you just tell me, sort of quick overview, what is it about the Clarence Thomas story that drew you to making this film, committing a large percentage of your time and your three sons' time into it?
Well, it came about because Clarence Thomas and I have mutual friends, and they let me know that he was getting annoyed or discouraged at having his story told by people his enemies, people who didn't like him. He was tired of half-truths and untruths being told about him. So I met with him, and after meeting with him and reading his memoirs, it was readily apparent to me that he had a great story to tell and that he was a great storyteller. So eventually I came up with the idea of this film. It's called Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in His Own Words, because it is really more or less Clarence Thomas telling his story his way. I conducted over 30 hours of interviews with Justice Thomas and his wife, Ginny, and they're the only interviews I conducted. And the idea is Justice Thomas looks right at the camera, right at the audience, and tells his story from the beginning up to today in his own words as he experienced it. So I ask people, even who do not agree with him, to see the movie, and you get his take on his life and America today. And it's an important, powerful take. And he has a great story, a great personal story.
Mm-hmm. Right. Truly American story in a lot of ways, right?
Yes. It's a very Horatio story. He was born in Pinpoint, Georgia, a Gullah-speaking area outside of on the coast. So Gullah is like a dialect, not English. So English not his native language, really, in a sense. And his mother raised them. His father left before he could remember, and he said, and he was really poor in Pinpoint. But then when he was 8 years old, his mother took him from Pinpoint to Savannah. And as he said, he went from rural poverty to urban squalor. And in Savannah, where she worked as a maid, he suffered real poverty, rather unimaginable today. And this was poverty in the segregated South. But he didn't have enough to eat. He didn't have a bed. He slept in a chair. His mother would bring him to school. He'd just leave and no one cared. And he'd wander the streets of Savannah. He was cold in the winter. It was real privation. And then after several years of that, his mother realized she couldn't take care of her two boys, and she brought them to her father, his grandfather, to raise. And that is what turned Clarence Thomas's life around for the first of many twists. So, and I think it's good to perhaps at this point get some overview of his life. So then his grandfather raised him, and his grandfather who had this sort of tough love, hard work ethic. His had all these sayings, one of which is, "Old man Kant is dead. I help bury him. No excuses. Work all the time. Work from sun to sun." And he was he believed in education. He himself was illiterate. Had really only 3 months of education, but he believed in it for these kids, and he sent them to a parochial school. He was Catholic, a very rare thing for an African-American in the segregated South in those years. And the Irish nuns, too, gave Justice Thomas hard work, a decent education. They loved these boys. It was a segregated school. Everyone was all black, but taught by Irish nuns. And Thomas thrived under those circumstances. He was a brilliant student. He did really well. And he did so well that he decided he wanted to be a priest. And he would have been one of the first African-American priests in Savannah, and his grandfather was very proud. So he had to go he was one of the first African-Americans integrating all white seminaries. And now it's the late 60s, and there he experienced really racism for the first time. And there are several instances of it, but it's sort of capped off in 1968 when he's watching TV in the seminary the day Martin Luther King Jr. is shot, and one of the seminarians says, "I hope that son of a bitch dies." And he is so shocked and appalled, and he anyway thought the church wasn't doing enough for civil rights. And that just that just sealed it for him, and he decided he didn't want to be a priest. He had lost his vocation. He had lost faith in America and his grandfather's ideas, and he went back and told his grandfather, who promptly kicked him out of the house, the only house he had ever known, the only father figure he had ever known. He had really nowhere to go. He had to go wherever, and he happened to have a full scholarship at Holy Cross in Worcester, and he went there, and he went through this period of Black radicalism. He helped start a Black student union. He engaged in a walkout. He invited a Black Panther to come to Holy Cross to speak. And he thought race and racism explained everything. He was, as he says, an angry Black man. And he went through this period. And then especially interesting maybe for ISI students is then he went through a period of being disillusioned with the left and coming back both to his faith and to what he thinks of his grandfather's views. It reached an emotional peak when he went to a rally in nearby Cambridge that sort of turned into a riot, and he felt himself caught up in the madness of the crowd and the hysteria, and he was horrified by what he had become. And when he got back to Holy Cross, he went to the chapel. It was well past midnight. It was closed, and he hadn't prayed in a long time. And he kneeled in front of the chapel and said that if God would, he prayed for God to bring the anger out of his heart, and that he would never hate again. And that was the beginning of his spiritual journey back, and gradually his political journey too. I mean, he saw the failure of what he thought of as liberal and radical social programs, and he gradually became more conservative through Yale Law School, and then finally working for Reagan in the 80s.
Right. Yeah, and what I love about the story is kind of the many threads that you get in, like, Clarence Thomas making it out of poverty, but also Clarence Thomas making it out of radicalism. We have the sort of Anita Hill scandal. We have the many issues that he faced when all of a sudden he was in the public eye, and this is a man that wasn't used to it. So really is a compelling story. Let me just ask you. I guess before we go into our sort of sneak peek, showing clips, project's over now. I guess sort of not, there may be other iterations of this particular one, and curious to hear you talk about that a little bit. But how does it feel? I know it feels good to be done, but how does it feel good to move on from a project? I feel like, we had all these Admiral Rickover friends when we were doing the Admiral Rickover project, and then it was the next thing. And, you're just sort of moving, entirely focused your life on one thing, and then you entirely focused on another. How do you make that switch? And is it sad to leave these things behind?
It is. And when they're over, you really do feel, you're glad that they're over, but it is kind of a letdown. You do feel a hollowness, until the next thing comes along. And in this particular case, we had a great theatrical run before the PBS broadcast in late January and February, where it's unusual for documentaries to be in many theaters. 5 or 10 is a lot. We were in 110 all across the country, and we got lots of reviews in the Washington Post, in the New York Times, in Time Magazine, and it did really well. And the COVID kind of shut that down. We had more or less finished, but COVID kind of ended it. And it took the kind of, even though this is an ideal time to be on PBS, because PBS's ratings are up because of COVID, and then we'll be streaming eventually, and those ratings are up. But you don't feel the lift of the number of screenings and events that you usually have at the end. I mean, even for the PBS broadcast, we would ordinarily have a party at our house and at least invite our friends. But what can you do? A Zoom party, maybe. But so it feels a little more abstract than usual. But it's true. You throw yourself into these projects, and a great thing about PBS documentaries, the budgets are generous enough that you can spend years on them. So you're in them for a long time. You really know them well. And then it's true, you move on. Although I feel we carry along some of the friends from the old shows too. I still see people from the Rickover film. I still see people from the last 600 meters. Rick Brookhiser from the Hamilton and Washington films. So they become part of your life, but it does feel hollow until you can throw yourself into another one.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I'm going to show a quick video clip from the movie. As I'm pulling this up, I want to remind everybody, if you have questions, drop them in this Q&A poll side of the tab. Continue to chat with one another and with us in the chat. Let us know what the sound quality is, talk about Clarence Thomas, but I'll ask Q&As from that Q&A tab. Okay, so you might want to mute your mic as the video plays.
Good morning, Judge. Welcome to the blinding lights. Finding out what you mean when you say that you would apply the natural law philosophy to the Constitution is, in my view, the single most important task of this committee.
Senator Biden was very focused on natural law. How did that go?
Who knows? I have no idea what he was talking about.
I just want to make sure we all know what we're talking about here, that you and I know at least what we're talking about here. There's a fervent and aggressive school of thought that wishes to see natural law further inform the Constitution than it does now, argued against by the positivist led by Judge Bork. Now again, that may be lost on all the people. You know and I know what we're talking about.
I have to be perfectly honest with you. You sit there and you have no idea what they are talking about. All I know is that he was asking me these questions about natural law.
Someone may apply it in a way, like Moore, who leads him in a direction that is, quote, liberal. You may apply it in a way that leads you in a direction that's conservative. Or you may, like many argue, not apply it at all. But it is a fundamental question that is going to be almost impossible for non-lawyers to grasp in an exchange. But you know and I know it is a big, big deal. And in conclusion,
one of the things you do in hearings is you have to sit there and look attentively at people you know have no idea what they're talking about. And it was fine. I understood what he was trying to do. I didn't really appreciate it. Natural law was nothing more than a way of tricking me into talking about abortion.
well, you know,
Since many Catholic moral philosophers saw the two things as intimately related. But my interest in natural law was different.
those who subscribe to this moral code view of natural law call into question a wide range of personal and family rights, from reproductive freedom to each individual's choice over procreation.
Right. So, perhaps one of the funniest moments in the film. We're not laughing because we've seen it a couple times, but I really think it's the sort of Biden dynamic with the older Clarence Thomas is great. Interesting to see how lively young Biden was actually for me.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't really want to talk about Joe Biden. I'm interested in this thing that, they both knew he was talking about and didn't know that he was talking about, and that's natural law. I don't know. Some of you have seen, we did a episode of this show, I guess, a week or so ago with Hadley Arcus, where it's sort of the issue of natural law sort of came up. I think natural law jurisprudence is an understanding of the Constitution as some, through the lens of natural law, as opposed to even other conservative judges that see Constitution just strictly as within the four corners of what the words say. What does natural law, mean to Clarence Thomas, and what did you leave out of the documentary when it came to his opinions on where that affects his jurisprudence?
Well, as I said earlier, I interviewed him and Jenny for over 30 hours. It's only a 2-hour film, so there was a lot on the editing room floor, and there was particularly a lot about his jurisprudence and his recent years on the court. I spoke to him for 3 or 4 hours on that, and there's maybe 10 minutes in the film devoted to it. But the natural law piece began when he it was ratcheted up when he was at the EEOC. When he was at the he was chairman of the Equal Opportunity Employment Commission, and while there, when he was confirmed, he after he was doing the job for a while, he hired as two speechwriters, former Claremont Fellows. As you know, Thomas, I was a former president of the Claremont Institute, so I particularly think fondly of it. But he hired two current Claremont Fellows, even John Marini and Ken Masugi, to be his speechwriters, and also to essentially give him a graduate school course in natural law jurisprudence. Mm-hmm. They assigned readings to him. They would discuss them on lunch hours, whenever he was driving to the airport, whatever free moment he had. As he said, he went to American Political Science Association meetings. He went to the Cato Institute to argue with positivists that have the view of the Constitution that you alluded to a minute ago. And he thought it was great. And it was a big part of his intellectual journey. And it's in the film, but in a short form. But we call the film Created Equal because of this natural law jurisprudence. The Declaration of Independence has a particularly strong role and importance to Justice Thomas. The idea is that the Declaration of Independence enshrines these ideas of natural law. First and foremost, that all men are created equal, but they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. Among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that these are the principles that the country is based on, the proposition, as Abraham Lincoln called it. And Lincoln, this is really, this is a key thing. So I have to submit my answer here. So for Thomas, the Declaration was important, and the Constitution was a way of realizing the principles of the Declaration. Abraham Lincoln, who had this view too, as you know, called the Declaration of Independence the apple of gold, and the Constitution the frame of silver around it. And the purpose of the frame was to realize and display the Declaration. So the Declaration was important to him, particularly that founding principle, all men are created equal, hence the title. And so that's his jurisprudence, a little bit different than Scalia's jurisprudence, for example. But in the clip that you showed, this sort of gets all mashed up. So, we have not talked too much about the confirmation battle, but he was nominated by George H.W. Bush to serve on the Supreme Court after he'd been on the D.C. Appeals Court. And he prepared all summer, and attacks started immediately, and they were grueling for his initial hearing before Anita Hill. He had a hearing that went on for a week, and that's a long time to be facing the blinding lights, as Joe Biden called them, and the senators, and they grilled him again and again and again. Biden was very focused on natural law, but they grilled him on everything else, especially Roe, and his views on abortion. And as Clarence Thomas said, even in the case of natural law, for Joe Biden, it was a way to get him to commit to what he was going to say on abortion, which he would not do. So it was a grueling, and it had the usual, what we are now accustomed to, media hype. They threw accusations at him that he was anti-Semitic, that he had a Confederate flag in his office, that he smoked marijuana, and he had to keep batting down these allegations. And it was a very contentious hearing. And then it ended. And the Senate Judiciary Committee, which was controlled by Democrats, Joe Biden was the chair, voted 7-7. So they split evenly on Clarence Thomas. And that was sufficient to send his name up to the Senate. And the full Senate was about to vote. And it looked like he would win the vote and become a Supreme Court justice. And it was at that moment that Anita Hill's allegations leaked first to Newsweek and NPR, and they were very explosive allegations. And because of them, the full Senate decided to ask the Judiciary Committee to reconvene, and they had several days further of hearings, but they never voted again. They had already voted. So the part you showed is from that first hearing. And then the second hearing sort of comes up later. I don't know is there a clip from part 2 of the hearing? I think so, right, Thomas?
There is. I don't know if we'll have time to show it. Worth noting that this, Joe Biden wasn't talking about natural law after the Anita Hill hearing, but it was a very fascinating part of the movie, the Anita Hill part, which we probably won't have too much time to go into, but we heard that part from Clarence Thomas's point of view. It was him telling
That's
his
right.
story.
We hear hear it from his point
which
of view.
in a lot of ways, best way to tell it.
Thank you, Thomas.
I'm going to jump to another video quickly. I'll say this: we're about 10 minutes away from Q&A. So if you have questions, drop it in that Q&A section of the Q&A tab of the next to the chat on the webinar. All right, so let's start this video.
Well, it's stereotypes draped in sanctimony and self-congratulation. There's different sets of rules for different people. If you criticize a black person who's more liberal, you're a racist. Whereas if you can do whatever to me or to now Ben Carson, and that's fine because you're not really black because you're not doing what we expect black people to do. It's a tactic, and when people see it being successful, they don't realize they're going to be the next ones in the Tower of London.
Okay, so we talked about a lot of different problems that Clarence Thomas has been through. You know, as we sort of walk through his life story, this one seems like it's not going away anytime soon.
Yeah.
So, yeah. I mean, I guess that's my main question about it. What can be done? How can we fix this problem where, you know, he's got this sort of, you know, media army trying to change the way they view him, how to punch back?
Well, documentarians are better at documenting problems than figuring out how to fix them. But I think it's important to say that this problem began as soon as Clarence Thomas became a public figure. When he started working for Reagan, and he was clearly a African-American conservative, having views you're not supposed to have when you're African-American. He was attacked viciously by the left from then on to today. Often in nakedly racist language, as you can even see in the imagery in that clip. While he was at the EOC, Harding Carter, a white Southern journalist, wrote a piece in Playboy and accused Clarence Thomas of being like a chicken-eating preacher gathering crumbs from the white man's table. You know, a kind of language you couldn't use about any liberal African-American. As Clarence Thomas says, you can say whatever you want about him or say Ben Carson, but not about, you know, black African-Americans on the other side of the spectrum. And that has gone on. It in some ways, for Justice Thomas, it reached a peak in Anita Hill, but it had been going on for many years, and it continued past the Anita Hill part of the hearing, as that clip suggests. And it is somehow he is a traitor to the race. He has views he's not allowed to have. He is treated in a way very different from a white conservative like Justice Scalia, for example. Mm-hmm. So I don't know what to do about that. It is something very deep in the culture. It's as Justice Thomas says in the film, it's like slavery. It's worse. He says it's worse than slavery. When he was at Savannah, there were parts of Savannah, when it was segregated, when he was growing up, there were parts of Savannah he couldn't go into. But you could avoid those parks, and so what? If there are ideas that you're not supposed to have, if you're only supposed to think a certain way, who could possibly live with that? And for him, that's what it is. And that explains part of his famous high-tech lynching speech during the Clarence Thomas, Anita Hill part of the hearings. Mm. But okay. I don't know. I rely on you, young conservatives, to figure out how to solve this problem. Maybe your listeners will have suggestions. I don't know. I think if there were more people like Clarence Thomas, it would be harder to put them down and put them in a box. But I think that I make the film because I think that by giving him his rightful place in the public life, this kind of view is mainstreamed. And that's why I really wanted it to be on PBS, not just on Fox or not just shown on conservative websites. I think his views are important, credible, and his story is moving, whatever your politics. And I particularly want people who don't agree with him to see it. And most of my films, all but one, have been on PBS because I particularly want to speak to those people, the people who don't agree with me, I mean. or in this case, don't agree with Justice Thomas. I think after you see the film, whatever your politics, you can no longer think he's stupid, like that clip you played suggests. He's an affirmative action hire. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He's clearly a man who speaks from both deep personal experience and deep intellectual experience. And I think by getting these films out on places like PBS, it forces people to see that kind of story and take it seriously.
Okay. Let me ask you this. I don't think I've asked you this question before, but there's obvious racial themes in this movie.
Right.
You made a movie, God in the Inner City, might have been 10 years ago, or maybe a little less, which also had obvious racial themes. And the Rodney King incident is clearly a race, movie kind of centered around race relations. What is it about this issue that kind of draws you to it? Why 3 movies about race?
Well, I think race is a huge issue in American life. I mean, to that extent, I agree with people I don't agree with about much, and things like the 1619 Project. I mean, I don't think race explains everything about America. I don't think America is only defined by race and racism, but surely slavery was the big stain on the country in 1776 and the founding era, the thing that America had to find a way to come to terms with. And after all, we went through the Civil War, a horrible war, and even that did not solve it. I think it is a huge issue in American life, and I think it is largely not understood. I think that we're taught to believe there's only one way of thinking about race. One thing that we really want to do with this film post its PBS broadcast is get it used in high schools for Black History Month, where other stories about African Americans are told all the time. There are stories of mass incarceration, of Black people arrested unjustly by the police, of the 1619 Project curriculum. So a story of a Black man making it, succeeding in America, not defining himself as a victim, as Clarence Thomas does not, and having a different view of how to solve problems in the Black community is really worth hearing. So I guess I'm drawn to it. Because of the importance of the topic and the emotionality of the topic. When you make films, it's not all about ideas. It's a lot about emotion too.
Interesting. Well, I think that's a good note to move on to Q&A for. I was reminded that we use memes when introducing people. I forgot to use yours, but I did make this meme, or my girlfriend made this meme. It's that we're meant to introduce you with. It's a Michael pack. Since you are Michael Pack, we have a pack of Michaels. It would be really a crime if I did one of these things without a single meme. So it had to be done. Okay. And also, you raised me like this. So again, your fault more than anything else.
Everything you do is my fault, right, Thomas? It's all the bad stuff. That's the rule.
I think that's the right way to look at it.
Yeah.
So people, let's see. People are asking about the Anita Hill scandal, probably as we expected. Tim Harker asks, did Thomas make any comparisons between the charade of his confirmation hearing and that of Justice Kavanaugh? This was sort of happening at the time. So did that affect things?
Well, actually, Kavanaugh was right while we were making the film, but after I conducted the interviews. But I know that Justice Thomas would not on camera comment about other political events. He wouldn't comment about Black Lives Matter. He wouldn't comment on the Me Too movement. He wanted to stick to talking about his life and the issues that it raised. But the comparisons between Kavanaugh and Thomas are so striking. And we have a cartoon in the film, a kind of anti-Thomas, anti-Kavanaugh cartoon of Kavanaugh and Thomas clinking glasses, a Coke can in Thomas's case and a beer can in Kavanaugh's case. And that was sort of a comic, a political cartoon that you saw in several forms. But the similarities were very impressive. I mean, the witness comes out at the very last minute, and the Democrats hold it to the last minute. And the charge, it's very hard for the person to sort of say disprove the charge, and there's not a lot of corroborating evidence, and it doesn't really matter, and there's all the believing the woman. So the comparisons are great, and I think I'm sure that they occurred to both Justice Kavanaugh and Justice Thomas and Justice Kavanaugh, but he didn't address it directly.
Okay. This question came up twice. One of them is from Will Corbin, and it's, what surprised you? So what did you learn from Clarence Thomas that you weren't expecting to learn from Clarence Thomas?
Well, since I knew very little about him before I made the movie, I learned a lot. But the thing about him, the two things that I learned that impressed me most are his sort of resilience, his overcoming one problem after another, and then his unwillingness to define himself as a victim. He could, he grew up in the segregated South. He suffered from dire poverty. He was raised by a single mother, and on it goes. But he won't define himself that way. I mean, he went through a period where he did his Black radicalism period, where race and racism explained everything. But once he climbed out of that, he wouldn't think of himself that way. I think we all have a tendency to fall back into victimhood. I mean, it's a very popular status these days, and even those of us that have little claim to victimhood, like us, Thomas, psychologically fall into that. And he's very impressive that way, and his unwillingness to do that, and his resilience in the face of one setback after another. And the Anita Hill setback is huge. I mean, the psychological impact of something like that is hard to measure. To be attacked day after day in the media, to have the media camped out at your doorstep, to have today in the internet age, it may be hard to imagine, but when there are only 3 networks and they're all about you, and there are only so many newspapers, and you're on the front page day after day, and they're not telling the truth about you, is hard to deal with. And he's able to sort of come back, and that's really impressive.
Okay. This one's from Kayla Gansrow. She writes, for those of us interested in hearing the other 3 to 4 hours of Clarence Thomas elaborate on his jurisprudence, are there any plans to eventually release the footage or transcript? I think many people who do not have the legal background to read all his legal opinions could benefit and be inspired.
We have thought about doing that, of doing a version for law schools, which have more of that. We commented on a few cases he did, and he described life on the court. But I have to say, since this is a question from a non-lawyer, that, as Thomas knows, when we do these things, we have screenings for sort of small groups of our friends and people that we know. Thomas participated in one. Thomas's mother sort of cooks dinner, and they got to watch the film and comment on it. And it's usually longer and longer until we get it down to time. And virtually everybody wanted less of his jurisprudence and his talks about the court, and more of his growing up, his grandfather, the Anita Hill parts, including lawyers, including members of the Federalist Society. So, yes, I mean, I think that's great stuff. I liked it. I put it even in earlier versions, and I think it's important to hear, and it is inspiring. So we hope that we'll have a way to do another version. You have to sort of raise money and get a kind of core group interested, but I think so. And more broadly, I think of the 30 hours of this interview as a great historical record. And I don't know what I'll do with it in the long run. We have to see what Justice Thomas thinks is okay, even though he had no editorial control over the film and he has no rights, but I wouldn't want to do something he doesn't want. But I think it's a great record. I mean, there's no Supreme Court justice has given that kind of access to any interviewer ever. So it's a great record, and I think it has historic significance, as well as some sections would be interesting from the editing room floor.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, let me take it another direction. I'm going to ask you 2 questions about his religion.
Wow.
So Thomas Moore wants to know, did Clarence Thomas ever lose faith altogether? And was he ever drawn to the religion of Malcolm X during his time in the Black Power movement? And then Giovanni Desir says, does Justice Thomas ever regret not being a priest?
He does. To answer the last question first, he sometimes says he misses the contemplative life that he had in seminary. He loved that. He kind of sometimes says he wishes he were there, but I think he really loves being a Supreme Court justice, and I actually think it is in fact a good gig. But he particularly loves it. And this is his moment on the court. He's finally has a chance for a lot of his views that were in the minority to be in the majority, and But I think he does miss that aspect of it. As for his religion, so I think he did lose faith. I'm not sure how complete it was during his radical period. I mean, essentially, the idea that race and racism explain everything replaced his idea that God and Catholic religion explains everything. Mm-hmm. So he effectively lost his faith. He didn't go to church. He didn't behave in a way that was in keeping with the precepts of the church. And it took him a while to come back, and it was a kind of back and forth journey. But he's very much a practicing Catholic today, and he has a prayer for humility in his office. I forget what saint came up with that prayer, but I always think, many more people in Washington, D.C. should say prayers for humility, a very rare virtue here in the nation's capital. So, his faith journey is an interesting one, and it's in the film. And it was really important to him. I think a very significant moment for him, faith-wise, was the Anita Hill part of the hearings. The first part of the hearings, the one from where Thomas showed the Biden clip, he was really on it using his own intellectual strengths. He's able to bandy with Biden and go back and forth, and he felt he knew natural law better than Biden, which is surely true. Biden got lost in the complexities, as that clip reveals. Even though he had to fight back with the media, he had advisors, and people knew, he thought it was sort of under control. But with the Anita Hill part, it was not. He was suddenly in a surreal world. He calls it Kafkaesque. We have a little clip from Orson Welles' The Trial to give a sense of what that's like. And he's in some surreal zone. And there he and his wife felt they had to fall back upon their faith to get through. As she says, he was spent. When they had finished the first hearing, he was spent. He says that it's like when the first part of the hearing was over and it went to the Senate, they took a holiday. They were relieved. He had run a marathon and the marathon was over. And then he's told, well, you've got to run a new marathon, start all over again. And there was nothing left of him, as his wife said. So they really fell back on their faith. I mean, they prayed a lot. They were not sure what to do. The decision to give the high-tech lynching speech ran against the advice of his handlers. So they were in a different zone, and faith was really important to them, and I think it really solidified their faith.
Just to jump on that last note that you mentioned, because somebody asked that question, where did this high-tech lynching comment, this famous comment, where did it come from? Where that's the strategy of saying that? You mentioned that it was not advised. So how did it happen?
Well, we tell the story at length in the film. I appeal to your viewers to watch it. So, Anita Hill, first he testified denying the charges, and then Anita Hill testified and laid out the charges. And people at the time were shocked, even though by today's standards, they're not that shocking. He talked to her about pornographic films. He famously discussed a pubic hair on a Coke can of his. I mean, people were shocked. Today, you could say a word like pubic hair, I don't know, on kids' television. I mean, the word pubic, not so shocking. But it was certainly sexual harassment. No one disagreed about that, but they disagreed with whether he said it or not. So it was shocking, and the nation was shocked. And then he had to go on and rebut those charges. And he hadn't watched her. He refused to watch. And he wasn't sure what to do, and he went to Senator Danforth, who he worked for in Missouri and was now and in the Senate and was sort of his sponsor in the Senate, and rested in his office and sort of rested and slept and had a kind of weird dreams. And part of his dreams, he thought about movies like To Kill a Mockingbird and the sort of history of Black men and their sexuality and their treatment. And he said to him, it was like a high-tech lynching. It was in the tradition of injustice towards Black men, and especially focused on their sexuality. And he came up with that idea, and when he woke up, and Senator Danforth said, if that's what you think, say it. So against the advice of his spin people, And their advice was good. If you want senators to vote for you, don't attack them and accuse them of lynching you. You need them to vote for you. You should say something nice. But he didn't. He felt that it was beyond getting the approval of the Senate and getting on the court. He felt he was fighting for his reputation. He felt that everything his grandfather and these nuns taught him was at stake. He thought he was fighting for them and their legacy. And he came out really strong in a way that shocked people. It shocked the senators, and it shocked the listeners who were tuning into the TV. This was early days of C-SPAN, and people were watching it live. And the people who watched believed Clarence Thomas and not Anita Hill 2-1. 2/3 of America believed him, and that went across race and gender, women, African Americans. He was a very powerful speaker. Over the years, the constant attacks on him that Thomas illustrated with a clip from the film have maybe flipped it the other way. But at the time, 2/3 of America believed him, and that is why he passed in the Senate by a very close vote.
Interesting. Okay, well, this one's from Michael Flynn, and he's interested in Thomas's deliberative reserve, which, as we saw in that first clip, perhaps helped him in the hearing. So he wants to know, did you discuss this with him? Was it a matter of intent or circumstance, being reserved and answering the questions? And maybe also there's other questions about his reserve and answer in talking during hearings as a Supreme Court justice.
Well, because he doesn't speak an oral argument, some people think he's not talkative. And it's sort of, he's just sort of surly. But if you watch the film, you'll see that he's actually a great storyteller, and he loves people, and he loves chatting with people. I mean, he says he's an introvert, and he is. I mean, his favorite thing is being alone with books. He reads lots and lots of books, and of course, Supreme Court justice, you've got to read lots and lots of legal material. So he doesn't have that kind of reserve. He's not as reserved as people think. And in the film, he talks about why he doesn't speak an oral argument. He doesn't want to take away, essentially, from the time given to the advocates, 30 minutes to each advocate to make their case. But he does have a kind of reserve. I will now give my own views of that. For one thing, he grew up speaking Gullah. And at one point, we do tell this story when he is at the seminary. One of the teacher priests there says to him, if you want to succeed in America, you have to learn to speak proper English. He was not speaking proper English. So he did. And Justice Thomas Leakey took that really seriously. In the end, in college, he majored in English because it was his weakest subject. But I think that not speaking it first gives him a little bit of a reserve. And I think that this relentless attack on him gives him a reluctance to speak to the media and a kind of a little bit of wariness. But he doesn't have that in person. If you have dinner with Justice Thomas, if you talk to any of his clerks, they think he's great. He has this huge booming laugh. We feature a little bit of him talking to his clerks in the film, and you get a feeling for that. But for them, it's the defining thing. His warmth, his laugh, his treating them like family. Everyone, all Supreme Court justices are good to their clerks, but Thomas is perhaps the best. He advises them on who to marry and on their career and whatever they need. And he is extremely warm. Mm-hmm. So both those things are there. I do not feel in the film that I captured his warmth, actually. I capture his ability as a storyteller. But when you're asking someone tough questions that they'd rather not ask you, they're not as friendly as they might be. So a story I like to tell, which Thomas has heard before, is I interviewed him. He requested 4-hour interviews, an extremely long interview. Not too many people could sit that long. His wife, only 2 hours, much more standard. But I promised, so I started at 8 and ended at 12, and I promised to shut the cameras off at noon promptly. And because he had to go to work, he is a Supreme Court justice, as his wife said to me, he has another real job. And of course, I knew that because I had done research. So I took seriously. Let him go at noon. I stopped the camera at noon, no matter what. And then, my wife, who was there on the set with my son, Thomas's younger brother, who was there every day. Thomas was only there one day. She had him go and ask Justice Thomas if he wanted to stay for lunch. And without fail, he stayed for lunch for another hour. That's why, I have this lecture from people who say he needs to get to the Supreme Court. And he wanted to chat, and he particularly wanted to chat with young people like Thomas's brother Alex or Thomas's friend Mimi, who was also a production assistant, and was very engaged in what their lives were like. I think that in the case of Thomas's friend Mimi, he convinced her not to be in the film business, but to consider law school. Clearly good advice that her parents are no doubt happy about. And he never forgot from time to time, even though weeks would go by, what she said last. And he was very engaged, and with the entire crew. And people kept saying to me, "Oh, why don't you capture this side of Justice Thomas when the cameras are on?" But when the cameras are on, people are a little different.
Although, to be, fair to you, you say you don't really capture his warrant. There's a section in the film where you have him talking to his law clerks.
Yeah, I do. I have that little bit of it.
And that really, I think, demonstrates the type of person he is, and that he likes the mentorship side of a Supreme Court justice, something not often talked about, but it's a huge deal to a lot of them. And you captured his belly laugh too, which is you had to do at some point in the film.
I got lucky. Yes, I got lucky to have that.
Okay, well, this one's from Samuel Mangold Lean. He says, if Justice Thomas had fought back, criticizing Democrats' assault on his character and legal philosophy as racist, do you believe the Anita Hill scandal would have been as prominent, or do you think they would have served to balance the narrative more? So if he had not been quiet and reserved when Biden was pushing him.
Well, I think the high-tech lynching speech is essentially accusing the Senate Judiciary Committee of being racist. I think that's the essence of it. So I'm not sure I understand the question. Am I missing something?
He's asking if Clarence Thomas had been pushing back in the first hearing, maybe the whole scandal wouldn't have happened, and he wouldn't have had to do the high-tech lynching speech.
Well, I don't think so. I think the scandal happened because he won people over in the first part of the hearing. I think if he had been voted down in the first hearing, then the scandal wouldn't happen. They needed to pull Anita Hill out because other things weren't working. So I think that, and in fact, there wasn't that much of race in the first part of the hearing. I mean, it was very focused on Roe, and I think that was the key for all the groups opposed to him. I mean, the thing they most wanted, I mean, it's true for Kavanaugh, but it was even truer perhaps in the Thomas era. They were afraid, women's groups and their allies were afraid that a conservative Supreme Court would overturn Roe v. Wade. That was their overriding fear, even more than anything else, and everything else was a tactic. And so in the first part of the hearing, that was the principal focus in natural law as a way to do that. I mean, other things too. I mean, they asked him plenty of other questions. But it wasn't racially tinged. I mean, there was a little bit, the media coverage of it was a little bit racially tinged. They did all this traitor to the race. He's not really black. They had black leaders, say he was not the right black man. Even Thurgood Marshall, who he replaced, was not really that kind to Justice Thomas. And they had a lot of black leadership. The Urban League and others come out on the other side. So. But it wasn't racially tinged the same way. So he didn't have an opening to do that. I don't think, and he had a reluctance to do that, to make it all about race.
Right. Just a reminder to everyone: if you have questions, drop them in the Q&A. We still have time to ask more questions. But this next one's from Margaret Harker. She asks, "Did anything surprise you about Ginny Thomas or Virginia Thomas?" Sorry.
Well, I mean. It might not be surprising, but I mean, one of the amazing things that I think the film reveals is the intensity of their relationship. I mean, I knew they were close, but the intensity of it is pretty clear in the film. I mean, you see that she was really right with him when he was there testifying. I mean, as she said, I mean, the two became one at that moment, and it's very much a sort of crucible where it either pulls you together or pulls you apart. And the intensity of that is amazing. I mean, she tells the story that on Valentine's Day, which is not in the film, on Valentine's Day, Justice Thomas would put lots of little Valentine's Day cards around the house for her to find. I mean, I'm lucky to remember one for my wife. It shames the rest of us. So it's an amazingly intense relationship. I mean, really strong. She, she was, maybe it isn't surprising, but she was, she broke down in talking about the Anita Hill confirmation part. She teared up. It's once is in the film, but it was more than once, and may not be surprising, but it was pretty moving to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let me ask you then, just building off of that, as you mentioned, there's only 2 interviews. It's Ginny Thomas and Clarence Thomas. I can see why you want to have it from Clarence Thomas's point of view, but you could have used other people that, affirmed his point of view, other people that knew him, but you chose only the one person, and you chose it to be Virginia Thomas. Why her? Why have a second person at all? What was the thought process going into that?
Well, I began the film by thinking it would be a traditional documentary where we'd interview, 12 or 15 people. And if you do that, you need to interview them across the political spectrum if you want any hope of getting it on PBS. So, that'd be multiple views on affirmative action, multiple views on busing, different opinions about Anita Hill. And I thought his voice would be lost. So I had and also I just didn't think I could get to the bottom of all these things. I thought it had more integrity to have Justice Thomas present his own views, to advertise it as that, and for it to be that. So we were going to interview only Justice Thomas. But at some point, the only suggestion Justice Thomas ever made about this film, and he had no editorial control, they didn't even see it until it was finished, but his only suggestion was that I interview Ginny. Mm-hmm. And that's it. And I think he wanted me to interview Ginny because she could say things, especially about the Anita Hill part of the hearing, that he simply could not say. As she said, the 2 were one. And I don't think I'm getting from Ginny, I didn't want from Ginny her views on Thomas, another point of view on Justice Thomas. It was a way of elucidating what was happening. I think of her as an extension of him. And indeed, in this genre of in their own words, especially one interview, I'm not the first one to interview somebody and their wife. Mm-hmm. There was a Hank Paulson documentary talking about his life and especially his experience in the 2008 crash when he was Treasury Secretary that interviewed only him and his wife. I mean, there's a sense that the wife provides, it isn't like getting many views across the political spectrum. So that's why I interviewed her. I mean, I was thinking I'll interview her, but I don't have to use it. I promised to interview her, but in fact, she was great. I mean, she was great. He was right about that. And I'm glad that I did. But Ginny, Clarence Thomas has not seen the film. Ginny has seen the film now, and she thinks it's great. She was, I'm not sure she's happy to have spent all that time being interviewed. It was not fun for her. Mm. But since he asked, she was sort of stuck too. So that's why just Ginny.
Yeah, I think it's fitting in a legal documentary that we're talking about precedent, and that it has been done before, that someone did wife and husband. Okay, great. Well, so this one's from Giovanni Tesser, and again, I apologize, by the way, if I'm butchering people's names. But she asks,
"Don't butcher my name, Thomas. That would not be forgivable."
Your name? Well, it's hard. I mean, it's got all those many syllables in it. What do you think is Justice Thomas's advice to people today who, like him in his youth, who were like him in his youth when he temporarily left Catholicism and the right?
You mean to people who are
losing religion or losing conservatism? What would he say to them? Losing their way.
Well, he does love speaking to young people. I mean, he that is a thing he likes to do. His favorite charity is the Horatio Alger Association, and it helps talented people from disadvantaged backgrounds, from poor families, succeed. And we have, in fact, promised to give a quarter of the proceeds of the theatrical release to his favorite charity. I have never heard him give advice to somebody in that situation. He often gets advice. Often has people to give advice to, or are ones that are already agree with him, that want to go to law school and want to succeed, or people like Thomas's friend Mimi that are young and sort of conservative and are not sure what they want to do. And he frequently tells them to go to law school. I think that it's very hard to give advice, I would say, to somebody like that. I mean, I myself, as Thomas knows, used to be on the left and now I'm on the right. I don't think I went through this faith journey, but everyone has to go through their own journey. At some level, it's hard to give advice. I think for Clarence Thomas, he had to hit a kind of bottom spiritually and emotionally to come back. I talked about that time in front of the church at Holy Cross. I don't think he would want to tell people that they too should hit bottom. I'm not sure. It's very hard to tell people how to recapture their faith. I mean, it's easier for him to talk about how he came back to his political ideas. And I think his journey back to the conservative ideas, which he also thinks are his grandfather's ideas and the ideas of the nuns, I think is also remarkable in that he did it on his own by thinking it through, not in a group. And he was very much influenced by a few key thinkers, Thomas Sowell, principal among them, and reading those books and thinking it through. But not that many people can think things through of any sort. And I give Thomas a lot of credit for that. Mm-hmm. So I'm not sure I'm that helpful for that answer, but that's a good question.
Mm. Well, I mean, since you bring up, him telling young people to go to law school, Tim Harker has a couple questions on that. He points out that Thomas has been openly critical of his Yale Law School experience. So he's wondering if he extends that to discuss his concerns with the legal academy as a whole. And then also later he also asks about why did he say why he gave Mimi that advice to go to law school?
Well,
these two questions seem connected.
Right. Well, he has been critical in the past of his Yale Law School period. He's less critical now than he had been, maybe in the 90s. At one point, he had a 10-cent sticker on his Yale law degree, and he put it in the basement of his house. I'm not sure he feels that badly about it, but they didn't support him when he was, during his confirmation battle, an unusual thing at the time, a graduate. But one of the ways he expresses his criticism, this is in the film, is he is unique among the justices. Now, maybe a few have imitated this, but for a long time, he was unique in that he looked for clerks that didn't go to Harvard, Yale, or the top 5 law schools. He has clerks from state schools, from Pepperdine, from schools that you wouldn't think of. And that's expresses, I think that's a way of talking about his views. And he did say to Mimi, I mean, I overheard, I don't know if you're allowed to report on things you overhear, that she'd get just as good a law school education at a state school and would save a lot of money. But of course, the reason to go to Yale or Harvard Law is to get a good job and do well. I think that he Justice Thomas, I mean, I'm not sure why he said that to Mimi. Thomas, who's Mimi's friend, would be maybe better suited to answer that question. But Mimi, Thomas's friend Mimi, I don't know what how much we should talk about someone absent, but she is a passionate, intelligent, well-educated young woman. She's Hispanic, she's Catholic, she's conservative. Justice Thomas thinks the law needs more people like that, and he was happy to snap her up. I happen to think so does the film business, but surely the law school is a better bet. You have a view on that, Thomas? What do I have say? Well,
yeah, I mean, I know that he does not take all of his clerks from Harvard and Yale like many other justices do. But yeah, clearly he loves the law, and some people need it. He wouldn't be doing what he's doing if it didn't seem important to him to do.
That's a very good point, Thomas. He loves it. He thinks it's great, so it's great for everybody. That's right. He
Thanks. Yeah, no, next time you can interview me. I have good.
I'm looking forward to it.
Okay, so this one comes from Gene Wisdom. Gene, you say this is your second question, and I only see one question, so you might want to resend me your first question. But he says, do you foresee a conservative / originalist nominee actually calling out the Democrats as a party in their treatment of them? The contrast with how Republicans have treated liberal nominees could not be more stark.
I think I think that it's pretty rare for a nominee to call out anybody. I mean, it's true that Justice Thomas gave this high-tech lynching speech, and Kavanaugh finally had to be kind of angry. But the advice to nominees is not to be angry or call out anybody, as I just said earlier. And I think Neil Gorsuch, who sailed right through, took that advice, and that's the way to go. And that's been true for the liberal appointees too. I mean, the Sotomayor and Kagan, they don't call anybody out. They try to be nice, and I think their supporters might be calling people out. I mean, that's the normal way to do it, and I think that I think the supporters of conservative nominees will call out Democrats, and rightly so when it's right, and it often is.
Okay. Let's see. Well, this one's from Paul Anderson, who's like has a mental Wikipedia for Supreme Court cases. So he writes, Justice Thomas is often considered to stand on the vanguard of originalist jurisprudence, such as his 1997 concurrence in Prince versus U.S. being sometimes credited for the Supreme Court taking the D.C. versus Heller case in 2008. What do you think are some other areas where we might see Justice Thomas's perspectives influencing the wider legal community?
I think another big area that he has influenced them and will likely influence them more is in these cases that are about the constitutional and legal basis of the administrative state. So he led the court in that. In the beginning, Justice Scalia did not agree with him on things like Chevron deference. Scalia voted for it, it supported it, and Scalia had a more hands-off. Look, the idea is, when should we defer to the views of executive agencies, or do they have more of an obligation to respond to the executive and legislative branches? Are they allowed to sort of make the law up themselves? And what is their legal status? And even to what extent can Congress even delegate powers to an executive branch agency? So Justice Scalia was reluctant to make an opinion on these cases. He wanted more to defer to the executive branch. And Justice Thomas wanted to go back to sort of original principles, and that is 3 branches of government, not 4. The administrative state, what is its justification? It's this huge, it's the thing that makes most of our laws, that has the biggest impact on our lives. I mean, we're day to day more affected by laws made by institutions like the EPA or OSHA than we are by laws made by Congress. Congress gives them very vague directions, and then these agencies fill in all the details, essentially making law. And then they have courts. They decide on the law. They execute the law. They have all 3 powers of government. I mean, it's a problem that Justice Thomas has called attention to in various ways over the years. And I think with Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, those cases will come back, and he maybe not be in the minority, but the majority on them.
Okay. Well, let me give you another combo question.
Okay.
I got Gene Wisdom's first question. He's interested in whether Justice Thomas discussed jurisprudence with his fellow justices. And Michael Frankel is interested in how Justice Thomas interacts with liberal justices on the court. So how has he talked to other Supreme Court justices?
Well, those are, I think I'll do those together, kind of. So in this part where he talks about life on the court that we didn't include, he does talk a lot about how he interacts with other judges. I mean, it goes to the point about oral argument. I mean, Justice Thomas feels, and everyone feels that knows anything, that oral argument isn't the center of what the Supreme Court does. It's what the public sees. It's the only part that's, I mean, it's not televised, but it's recorded, and you can hear the audio. So it's the only thing that the public gets to hear and see. So we think that's the whole case. But the Supreme Court is an appeals court, and most of it is done in writing and talking. So the two sides submit briefs, and there are amicus briefs, and there are hundreds of pages of those. And so the opinions circulate, and the justices talk. And Thomas takes a very lead role in that, as every justice will say. So he does get along. I mean, I think they were all reported to be a pretty collegial experience. I mean, they do get along sufficiently to talk about things, even though they don't really agree. And as Justice Thomas said in this section, it's not when a case comes up, someone mentioned Heller, like a gun rights case, it's not the first gun rights case. They are in an ongoing discussion about this. So he knows what, say, Justice Ginsburg thinks about Second Amendment cases. So the next one is a continuation of their ongoing discussion and debate about how to interpret the Second Amendment. So it's a long process spanning years, very different from the legislative process and very different from a courtroom in something like To Kill a Mockingbird, a criminal trial. And that's why some people, I think, misunderstand the Supreme Court, because they think of oral argument like they're convincing the jury, and that you're supposed to be making grandstanding speeches. But it isn't that. It's talking about these things, exchanging pieces of paper, commenting on other people's writing, in an ongoing way, going over years. And I think that is important to understand. So that answers both, I think.
Mm-hmm. Great. So a lot of you are asking kind of political questions. He won't talk to us about what he thinks about Trump or what he thinks about certain immediate political issues that might go to the Supreme Court. Like someone asked about the recent free speech issues. So that's just it. I'm not ignoring your questions if those are your questions. We just don't know the answer. And then just quickly, people are curious. How is his health? Do you think he's planning on retiring? What other insider info do you have?
Well, I saw him maybe 3 or 4 months ago, and I mean, his health looked like he was in good health.
Yeah.
He has said to me, and he has said this to other people, that the Supreme Court, being on the Supreme Court, is a job for life, and that's how he's treating it. He's having a great time. He loves being a Supreme Court justice. As I said earlier, this is sort of his moment. I mean, his power is greater. He's got more colleagues. I think he's unlikely to retire unless his health takes a downturn. And he's not the most likely Supreme Court justice whose health will take a downturn. He's not the oldest. So, but who knows? I mean, who knew what would happen with Scalia? It's all hard to say, but I don't think he's likely to retire. I could be proven wrong. I don't actually have any inside information. I hope he stays healthy during this COVID crisis. But I don't know. I hear that he is doing well.
Right. It seemed healthy to me. The most sort of memorable moment in the film, maybe for him in his life, is when he was asked, "Do you want this job?" And he said, "I'd rather die than withdraw from the process." So
right.
It's interesting that you say he loves being a Supreme Court justice. I don't think that when he took the job, it was certain that he would love it. I mean, it seemed like there were aspects that once he took it, it seemed tarnished for him. So it's great that he still wants to do this job years and years later.
Well, that's true. Although he loved being an appeals court judge too. I mean, he did like that. Mm-hmm. I mean, Thomas is one of these people who loves whatever he's doing and throws himself into it. And that's part of the grandfather ethos. Even if you're delivering home heating oil, you're supposed to be doing it the best you can do it. And you're supposed to be passionate about it. You're not supposed to really be into it. You're not supposed to look down on it. So Thomas would be unlikely to take that view of anything. But it's true that in the beginning, he came under this cloud, and and that might have made it difficult. Although he says that all the other justices accepted him and were welcoming, and it wasn't a problem. But surely to go through a bitter experience like that, it's hard. It takes a while to come back from.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great. And Maggie Roberts, first off, Maggie, congratulations on your recent wedding. But Maggie asks, did Justice Thomas discuss his unique friendship with Justice Ginsburg? Did he mention that to you at all?
He didn't talk about his relationship with Justice Ginsburg, but he did talk about his relationship with Justice Scalia.
Mm-hmm. Questions about that one too.
Okay, well, and we didn't put that in the film either. I mean, it felt like it was too much about Scalia then. I mean, he really loves Scalia. He loves Scalia's humor. You know, they were very close. We have Jenny Thomas say that Justice Scalia said that Thomas was a bloodthirsty originalist and that he took that as a badge of honor. So that's like a clue if you get who's a bigger originalist, Thomas or Scalia, you know, in your questions from Thomas Pack here. So I don't know. He did not speak too much about his relationship with any other justice. I mean, I think he gets along with all of them. I'm not sure that he gets along particularly well with Justice Ginsburg, but he does. I mean, you know, I think I'm not sure that but they all seem to get along up to a point, but they don't see the law the same way. I mean, there are radical differences, which they don't like to talk about in public, but there they are.
Right. Also, there's a couple questions I can ask you building off of that. I mean, one is from Christine, who asks, you know, they're friends, and then shortly after Scalia passed, Thomas broke his long-standing tradition of silence in oral arguments. Do you have a sense of what prompted that? Was it related to Scalia?
But no, I don't think it was. I mean, he speaks occasionally in oral arguments, you know, and that's it. Look, I don't think he's going to speak. People keep saying, well, now is he going to speak more in oral arguments? But I don't think he will. For one thing, he's extremely stubborn. We have a line in the film that his mother said when he was born, he was too stubborn to cry, and that was the pattern. If you want Justice Thomas to do something, it's hard to get him to do it. You know, I had to direct him. He was not easy to direct, you know, and even in little ways. So the fact that everyone thinks he should talk in oral argument isn't going to get him to talk in oral argument. He doesn't believe it important. He doesn't believe it has bearing on his work. I don't know that he will do it more. I mean, I think it would be great if he did. I see his point, though. I mean, it doesn't really matter in the long run. And he's right that the justices that use it as a way to convince each other are taking away from the advocates' time to make their case. So, and he points out how this tradition of talking in oral argument is very recent. And there are many periods of the court where very famous justices said nothing. Even Thurgood Marshall, who he replaced, said very little in oral argument. I think Justice Scalia particularly made oral argument banter a kind of Supreme Court form. And the fact that it could be taped and put on the air and people liked it made everybody want to do it. But Justice Thomas doesn't see it that way. So I'm not sure that he'll talk more.
Right. Well, can we get a fact check on whether or not he broke his silence in the court when Scalia passed? Because I think he had asked clarifying questions before that, but is still for the most part silent.
He had asked clarifying questions before that. We even had a little bit in the film about one. And some of them I actually considered using one. I mean, he had a very good series of questions about gun rights, since someone brought that up already. I'm not sure if it was in Heller, but it was in one of these cases where he talked about, in oral argument, in questioning people, the history of denying African Americans the right to bear arms as part of racist Jim Crow South. There's nothing that scared segregationist Southerners more than armed black men. And he referred to that tradition. I was going to use that. It was a sort of good section, but just too much. So I have a couple of oral argument questions he did ask that were kind of interesting, that are usable, but they're not. It's nothing like the Scalia thing, where every time. I mean, now, as Justice Thomas says, the advocates start to speak, and boom, right away they're interrupted, and then a justice might interrupt another justice. And there's a kind of little factoid that in recent years, while the number of questions from justices hasn't risen steeply, what's risen steeply is the length of each justice's question. Because rather than asking a clarifying question, as you just referenced, Thomas, justices give themselves little speeches. And is that right? I mean, shouldn't it be the advocates doing that? I don't know. I don't have an opinion. I'm not a Supreme Court justice, and I'm not likely to be one. I made the decision that Thomas did not think Mimi should make early on, so my chances of being a Supreme Court justice have gone down to 0.
Yeah. Right. Well, so staying on this topic of, Scalia, Giovanni Dezer asks, which Supreme Court justice would Thomas have viewed as his idols?
I don't think he would want to use that term. He always says the idols that he points to are first and foremost his grandfather and these nuns, first and foremost all the time. But secondly, it would be people like Abraham Lincoln, Frederick Douglass. He has a long quote from Frederick Douglass in one of his most famous dissents. I don't think he would pick a Supreme Court justice. He said nice things about Thurgood Marshall, who he replaced, even though Thurgood Marshall didn't support him. He said nice things about many justices, but I'm not sure that he would pick one as a model. I mean, everybody loves John Marshall. I mean, he would have to, right? Everybody does. My colleague and friend Rick Brookhiser is making a documentary about John Marshall. I'm sure it'll be great. People should tune into that wherever that's on. But everyone loves John Marshall, although, Thomas Jefferson didn't love him. So he had his, controversies at the time too. So I'm not sure who Justice Thomas would pick, if anyone. Okay.
Well, let me ask you this question. You alluded to this earlier and it sort of got swept up in the conversation, but these are hard things to talk about. You were the one interviewing him on topics like, Anita Hill, and also his first wife, his son, the backlash he faces, things people don't want to talk about. So what did you do? How were the techniques? How did you get him to tell the story that you needed to get the clips that you needed to put the whole story in the film?
Well, every interview is different, and it's hard to get what you need from interview subjects. I mean, that's a big part of documentary filmmaking. But once I was on the mode of talking to him for over 30 hours, I knew I would get it. There'd be enough time, and we would go back. Justice Thomas was not guarded. He made a decision, and I feel blessed that he made it, to give me this access. And he tried to tell the truth and be forthcoming. And once he made that decision, he made the decision. There were some things he just wouldn't talk about, like his first wife. Mm-hmm. But, and I did have to push him on things like Anita Hill. I mean, it was pushing him on Anita Hill that got him to say, interview Ginny, right? He got tired of being pushed. But he was willing to go there. He made that decision. I think he was convinced that it was important to get this story out. Well, this was a good time to tell it. Well, he's still... he's young, he can tell the story, he remembers it all well. So in his case, that's what it took. It was getting him on that track and then being persistent. I mean, everyone tries to evade the question they don't want to ask. You have to just keep going back to it until such point as the person simply says no. I mean, I'm not one to invade a person's personal space, to attack them or use a trick. Use one of these interview tricks to get them angry, to be deceptive. But being persistent, I think, is legitimate. And Justice Thomas did have a habit of wandering away from things he didn't want to discuss, but I could always go back to it. And he never treated the question as out of line or in bad spirit. And he tried hard to answer. He listened carefully and he tried hard to answer them.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. I believe that there are people watching this webinar that are interested in seeing the film or learning more about the film or learning more, maybe reading more about Clarence Thomas in the meantime. What do you recommend they do?
Well, first and foremost, they should go to our website, justicethomasmovie.com, which you mentioned earlier, where you can see the full trailer, which I think gives you a better overview of the film, and some of the places and some background about it. So I think his memoir is great. It's called My Grandfather's Son. There are many books on Clarence Thomas written by people who like him and don't like him. I mean, a vast army of those books. I believe it's good to read some of his opinions. They're readily gettable. I mean, you Google them, you find them. We talk in the film about this Grutter case, an affirmative action case. And I think his dissent in Grutter is brilliant. And it's a 30, 40-page dissent. It starts with this Frederick Douglass quote, a famous Frederick Douglass quote, leave us alone. I don't think I'll go over it, but and it's a brilliant argument. And I think you get a sense, one thing you can't do in a documentary is give a sense of a detailed argument like that. I mean, a 30-page brief cannot be summed up. And any attempts to do that, our film is often compared to RBG, a documentary about Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And they give her, we only did a little of this, but they have a lot about her opinions, and they're often reduce her opinions to one sentence. But it doesn't do justice to a 30-page argument by Ruth Bader Ginsburg or Clarence Thomas. So I think it's worth reading some of his opinions. I recommend Grutter, but they're whatever topic that you're interested in. They're readily gettable. I don't feel that they're easy or fun reading. I will say that. My Grandfather's Son is fun, not fun, but easy reading. So I think that those are good places to start. I think that if you're interested in all these other films featuring Thomas Pack, you should go to the Manifold Productions website, which is manifoldproductions.com, where we have trailers from other films and ways that you could purchase them or download them. And the one that features Thomas most prominently, the Rickover film, at least recently, was streaming on Amazon Prime, and it's called Rickover, The Birth of Nuclear Power. I will give you the clue that the first time we see Admiral Rickover, walking in the woods, it is not Admiral Rickover, but Thomas Pack. You may not recognize him because his performance is so moving and so thorough.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to clarify on that point that this makes me the star of the show.
Yeah.
And then I played Rickover in any other scene after the opening scene where you see an actor as Rickover. That actor is doing an impression of my Rickover.
Right. That actor is Tim Blake Nelson, who, unlike Thomas, has been in a huge number of movies, especially Coen Brothers movies. He was the star of The Ballad of Buster Scruggs recently. He was in Oh Brother, Where Art Thou? Thomas's filmography is more limited, but prestigious in its way.
Prestigious in its way. And also, if you are interested in more, films with me, well, maybe not films, but content with me in it, you can continue watching these webinars. So, we have coming up, this one won't feature me, but it will feature Yuval Levin on May 7th at 7 p.m. And we have a conference that will feature me on science, scientism, and society on May 16th. You can find those and the information on those webinars on our website. Sign up on join.isi.org so you keep getting information because we're rolling out other things, potentially video contests for students, other webinars coming up. I don't know. I don't know if you watch these or if you just say you watch these, but I have done quite a few that I've sent to you.
Yes, I watch them. I recommend them highly. And I like Yuval Levin. I mean, it does matter what you think of the people it isn't all you, Thomas. It has a lot to do with the professors that you round up, and you do a good job of rounding up good ones. I think Yuval Levin always has something interesting to say to promote that one in particular. But no, they've all been good. I thought the one on free speech with Hadley Arkes and Arthur Millick was great.
Yeah,
and it dealt in a very subtle way with this natural law question. Mm-hmm. And their differences on natural law were pretty subtle and sophisticated. I mean, rare to see that.
Right. Great. Well, I mean, with that, it's 5:30. I've got to wrap up, but thank you so much for coming on. It was great to have you. This was a ton of fun for me. Very unique experience to interview your father, and I hope the rest of you liked it. Dad, I love you. I'll see you soon, hopefully.
I love you too, Thomas. Thank you for not asking intensely personal questions that you could have asked.
Yeah, okay. All right. So with that, bye, everybody. Thanks for coming on.
Goodbye.